Hello, welcome to our RecapPlus channel with me, Matthew. Today we will watch a recap movie called Rage, released in 2014. This is a spoiler content video. So please turn on the subtitle and let's start the story. The movie starts and we see a man occupying the room, his demeanor calm, yet his gaze fixated on the door. Moments later, the door creaked open, revealing an individual aiming a gun at him. Paul, the father, picked up his daughter, Caitlin, from school. Her face lit up upon seeing her father waiting for her. However, Paul couldn't help but notice a henna drawing on her hand. During their journey home, Paul handed Caitlin a book of practice questions for her upcoming student admissions examination. She gently reminded him that the exam was still a year away. Paul also inquired about the progress of Caitlin's paper, expressing his hope that it would be published soon. Caitlin eagerly revealed that her paper was nearly complete. After dropping Caitlin off, Paul headed to a bar to meet up with his friends. They discussed the preparations for Caitlin's upcoming 16th birthday celebration, which would take place at the bar the following Saturday. Paul made it clear that her birthday would remain alcohol and drug-free. The conversation shifted to their youthful misadventures and the troubles they had caused in the past. Later, Paul attended a press conference with the town mayor. During the conference, a reporter asked him about the project's profit allocation. Paul explained that the project's profits would be directed towards education and healthcare. In the evening, Paul and Vanessa readied themselves for a dinner hosted by Thompson and Dean White. Thompson was associated with the governor's office and seemed poised to become a provincial police officer. Vanessa saw this as an opportunity to build connections. Before leaving for dinner, Paul ensured that Caitlin remained at home with her friends, emphasizing the importance of focusing on her studies. He also had a conversation with Mike, Caitlin's friend, in the kitchen, discussing Mike's job and relationships. Paul even encouraged Mike to pursue a connection with Caitlin. As the evening progressed, Caitlin was left at home with her friends, and Paul couldn't help but feel uneasy. Midnight approached, and his worry for his daughter grew. To mask his anxiety, he engaged in discussions with his associates. Suddenly, a police detective named Peter approached him, bearing grave news about Caitlin. They hurried back to Paul's house, where police cars and ambulances were gathered, along with Mike and Evan. Peter explained that Caitlin, Ian, and Mike had been together during an incident where they were kidnapped by 3 criminals. Though they tried to resist, the assailants succeeded in abducting Caitlin. Peter inquired if Paul had any conflicts or issues with someone that might have led to Caitlin's kidnapping. Although slightly irked by the question, Paul was confident that he had no such problems. Vanessa offered unwavering support, encouraging Paul to take any necessary steps to locate Caitlin, as her disappearance left her heartbroken. The following morning, Vanessa watched the news on TV, which featured the broadcast about Caitlin's disappearance. Meanwhile, Paul was determined to begin his search for Caitlin. He left, accompanied by several on-duty police officers, and first visited Mike's house. Paul couldn't help but feel disappointed, as he had expected Mike to protect Caitlin. He inquired if Mike had any recollection of the abductors, but regrettably, Mike couldn't remember any details. Paul then reached out to his friends, urgently seeking their assistance. He offered them money as a reward for their help, but they adamantly refused, considering Paul as family. Denis and Kane decided to approach Oliver for information regarding Caitlin, but Oliver remained tight-lipped. The next day, they returned to Paul with the disappointing news that they had not uncovered any information about Caitlin. One day, a man who was jogging near the river made a grim discovery, a body floating in the water. Shortly after, a police officer who was accompanying Paul received a call informing him that Caitlin's body had been found. Upon hearing this devastating news, Paul was overwhelmed with sadness and shock. He went to the hospital to see Caitlin's lifeless body, shedding tears of sorrow as he kissed her forehead. On the day of Caitlin's funeral, Paul was joined by his old friends and colleagues. Among them was Francis, one of Paul's old friends, who expressed his condolences for Caitlin's tragic death. Afterward, Francis approached Paul, who was in a wheelchair, to engage in a conversation about their shared criminal past. Francis observed that Paul now had a comfortable life, including a job, a house, a successful business, and a beautiful wife. He surmised that Paul must feel compelled to take action in response to Caitlin's loss. Paul sensed an underlying meaning in Francis's words and became skeptical of his intentions. Francis suggested that Paul should turn over the case of his daughter's death to the police, but Paul brushed off his advice. Francis persisted, reminding Paul of the assistance he had provided in allowing him to leave his criminal life behind. He now wanted Paul to reciprocate by letting Caitlin go and involving the police. Their conversation concluded with Paul walking away from Francis. Following Caitlin's funeral, Paul, Vanessa, Denis, and Kane returned to Paul's house. However, Paul asked Vanessa to leave, leaving the others to discuss matters in the kitchen. Seeking advice, Paul explained his desire to investigate Caitlin's death, even though Francis was keeping a close watch on him and issuing threats. The group recalled past incidents they had successfully resolved without leaving any trace at the police station. Meanwhile, two policemen engaged in a discussion about Paul and his enigmatic past. They debated how someone with a dark history could transform into a legitimate businessman without any apparent missteps. The younger policeman presented data indicating the weapon used by the criminal. The weapon used to kidnap Caitlin was an old Soviet Union pistol, a Tokarev, which evoked memories of the Chernow family murders. The first incident occurred in 1983, and the other two in 1988. This suggested that the killer had been dormant for a long time and had resurfaced. The following morning, Paul sat in the dining room, gazing at the paper Caitlin had created. He handed it to Caitlin's schoolteacher and collected her belongings from her locker. As he reflected, he spotted a mother and son playing with a ball in a nearby field, reminding him of his wife and Caitlin. Two of Paul's friends suspected that the murderer might be Chernov, a Russian mafia hitman employing a Tokarev TT-33 pistol. They visited Paul's home, attempting to convey their belief that Caitlin's killer had Russian mafia ties. In the afternoon, they rendezvoused with Danny and set out to locate Caitlin's assailant. They entered a gambling establishment, where Paul and his friends engaged in a fierce confrontation with the occupants, ultimately prevailing. The next day, Paul and Vanessa engaged in a heated argument when he insisted that she pack her bags and leave his house. Vanessa was reluctant to depart their home, but Paul was determined to ensure her safety. Paul, along with Danny and Kane, sought information from alternative sources. Paul believed he needed the assistance of a Russian gangster to uncover Caitlin's murderer. They met an individual in a bar who bore tattoos on his neck. Paul recalled an incident from 19 years ago when he had stolen money. It turned out that the man recognized Paul and tried to flee, but Paul apprehended him. Paul questioned the man relentlessly about Caitlin's killer, but the man died from a gunshot wound to the stomach, fired by Danny, as he attempted to escape the bar. Feeling frustrated and despondent, Paul returned home and later went to the bar to meet with a detective. The detective asserted that Paul's actions would not bring his daughter back to life. He recounted a personal experience where his own son had been struck by a car. Although he had contemplated shooting the person responsible, his son had recovered. Paul found this comparison irritating, emphasizing that Caitlin had tragically died, while the detective's son had survived. Paul, Danny, and Kane proceeded to investigate a house suspected to be the base of Caitlin's assailant, searching for the mastermind behind the murder. They eventually confronted and defeated Chernov's men. The following morning, the police arrived at the ransacked house, discovering it was a drug den under Chernov's control. The officers were taken aback by the condition of the house. The detective felt defeated, realizing someone had destroyed Chernov's operation. Upon receiving the news of the attack on Chernov's drug base, Chernov's men reported the incident to him. Naturally, Chernov was furious and disgusted by the person who had killed his men without his consent. Chernov's men quickly descended upon C's bar, where they subdued Kane and forcibly took him away. Upon learning of this, Paul became furious and gave chase, recklessly violating traffic laws and crashing into cars several times. The police also pursued Paul, eventually managing to apprehend him. Paul was seething with anger and frustration, having lost track of Chernov's men along with Kane. However, the detective decided to release Paul, allowing him to take matters into his own hands. Chernov arrived at his base and interrogated Kane about why he had killed his men. Kane disclosed that Chernov was Caitlin's killer. Enraged, Chernov executed Kane. After his release by the detective, Paul made his way to Danny's hideout. A heated argument escalated into a physical confrontation. Danny believed he had been loyal to their friendship, but Paul accused him of betrayal, revealing the 19-year-old incident involving Francis, which ultimately reached Chernov's ears. Danny vehemently denied the accusations, leading to a tragic conclusion as Paul accidentally stabbed Danny in the stomach, resulting in his death. Chernov decided to confront Francis after Danny's death and used Kane's body as proof of his resolve. Chernov explained that Kane had been one of the individuals responsible for his brother's death, and Paul's actions had made enemies out of Chernov and Francis. Chernov had a request for Francis, but Francis adamantly refused to submit to people like Chernov. This led to a heated exchange of gunfire, resulting in Francis's immediate demise. After Danny's death, Paul decided to return home. On his way, he reminisced about his daughter's tragic death, the events of 19 years ago, and the memories of Danny and Kane. Upon arriving home, Paul opened the gun case associated with the events of 19 years ago when he and his closest friends had stolen the money. As he opened the box, Paul couldn't help but cry and feel guilty for what had happened to his best friend. Later that evening, Ian and Mike met in front of a building, where Evan had left them. Mike was unaware of Evan's intentions, but it became apparent that Evan had orchestrated the meeting to bring Mike and Paul together. When Paul arrived, Mike was terrified and finally confessed that Caitlin's death was his fault. He recounted the true story of what had happened when they were playing with Paul's gun, unaware that it was loaded with bullets. They had been drunk at the time, and with his back turned to Caitlin, Mike accidentally shot her in the head. In a state of fear and confusion, Evan and Mike staged the scene to appear as if they were attacked by robbers or the mafia. Back at home, Paul was shocked and filled with remorse upon hearing Mike's unexpected confession. Initially, Paul contemplated killing Mike, but he ultimately decided against it. Instead, he reached out to Vanessa, explaining that the situation was under control. He confessed to his dark past and apologized for letting her down. Sadly, Paul ended the call and prepared to end his own life by stabbing himself with a knife. Thank you for watching. If you enjoyed this video, don't forget to subscribe for more content like this. You can also click on the videos on your screen to watch more interesting videos. And please share your thoughts about today's video in the comments down below. Lastly, always remember to stay safe and stay healthy. See you in the next video.